Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're heading to Indonesia
Okay.
to explore a harrowing chapter,
Yeah.
the mass killings of 1965 to 66.
Right.
And we're focusing specifically on the Chinese community in the region of Aceh,
Okay.
an area with its own unique history. We'll be drawing heavily from the research of Jess Melvin, a scholar who really dug deep into this often overlooked tragedy.
Melvin's work is crucial because it challenges a lot of the prevailing narrative about this period.
Right.
And it reveals a level of calculated brutality. That's truly disturbing.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider the deliberate targeting of the Chinese community.
Right, because this wasn't just random violence. It was systematic and orchestrated. But before we jump into the killings themselves, let's set the stage a bit.
Sure.
What was Aceh like before 1965?
Well, Aceh had always had a bit of a strained relationship with the central Indonesian government during the Indonesian National Revolution. It functioned as a semi-autonomous military region, almost like its own entity. Then in 1951, that autonomy was stripped away. The central government revoked Aceh's provincial status and merged it with East Sumatra. That move sparked a rebellion, known as the Darul Islam Uprising, adding another layer of tension to the region.
So even before the events of 65 and 66, Aceh was a bit of a powder keg politically.
Absolutely. And within that context, you had a diverse Chinese community, some aligned with Beijing, others with Taiwan. This internal dynamic, unfortunately, would become a tool for the military to exploit later on.
Okay, so we have this backdrop of political tension, a history of rebellion, and a diverse Chinese community. Then comes October 1st, 1965, and the attempted coup in Jakarta, the so-called 30 September movement.
This event, though poorly planned and executed, was seized upon by the Indonesian military. They used it as a pretext to move against their rivals, the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. It's almost like they were waiting for any excuse to unleash a wave of violence.
And what's even more disturbing is that Melvin uncovered evidence of a military operation called Operasi Berdikari.
Yes.
Apparently, this plan to eradicate the PKI was developed months before the coup even happened.
Operasi Berdikari went live on October 1st, the same day as the coup attempt.
Right.
That suggests a chilling level of premeditation. The military was poised and ready to strike, using the coup as a justification for a much broader and more sinister agenda.
So this wasn't a spontaneous reaction to the coup. This was a calculated campaign of violence. And Aceh's military commander, Roosa, played a key role in implementing it.
He was instrumental in mobilizing troops, spreading propaganda, and creating an environment where violence became almost inevitable. He used existing power structures, like the Jatur Tunggal and the Panca Tunggal, to disseminate orders and control the flow of information.
Wait, what are Jatur Tunggal and Panca Tunggal? I'm not familiar with those terms.
Think of them as local leadership bodies,
Right.
with Jatur Tunggal having 4 pillars and Panca Tunggal having 5.
Okay.
Typically, they'd help with regional governance, but in this case, the military twisted them, using these bodies to control the narrative and direct the violence. It's a chilling example of how existing structures can be manipulated for nefarious purposes.
So the military essentially weaponized these local leadership groups to carry out their agenda.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They went further, creating and spreading elaborate lies to demonize the PKI and incite fear among the population.
Like what kind of lies?
Well, for example, they spread rumors that PKI supporters were poisoning food supplies and massacring villagers. These were completely fabricated stories, but they were incredibly effective in creating a climate of terror and turning ordinary people against anyone associated with the PKI.
Melvin's work really exposes the power of propaganda in this whole situation. It's almost like they were waging a psychological war alongside the physical violence.
Absolutely. The military understood that to achieve their goals, they needed to control the narrative, and they did that masterfully, using propaganda to demonize their enemies, incite fear, and justify their own brutal actions.
This manipulation of information is so unsettling, but it's crucial to understand, especially when we're looking at how the Chinese community was targeted.
That's right. The military deliberately blurred the lines between the PKI and the Chinese community. Even if a Chinese person had nothing to do with the PKI, they could still be targeted, based solely on their ethnicity.
And how did they do that? How did they manage to connect these two groups in the minds of the public?
They strategically lumped together the PKI and Bapurki, which was an organization for Chinese Indonesians.
Okay.
Now, Bapurki wasn't inherently political, but the military portrayed it as being inseparable from the PKI, claiming they were both communist fronts.
So even if a Chinese Indonesian had zero interest in communism, they were still labeled a threat.
Yeah.
Just because of their ethnicity. And this association with Bukirke.
Precisely. It was a deliberate and cynical tactic, designed to make the entire Chinese community a target. We see this clearly in Melvin's research on the case of Asan, the sole survivor of the PKI's provincial secretariat in Aceh. Asan wasn't just targeted for his political beliefs, he was targeted for being ethnically Chinese, making his very existence a threat in the eyes of the military.
That's truly chilling. It's a stark reminder of how prejudice and scapegoating can be used to justify horrific violence.
And sadly, this was just the beginning. The targeting of the Chinese community in Aceh would become even more brutal in the months that followed.
Okay, we've laid out the groundwork, the context in the early stages of the military's campaign. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll delve deeper into how this violence escalated and the specific ways in which the Chinese community was targeted. So we've talked about the political climate in Aceh and the military's calculated plan to exploit the attempted coup.
Right.
Things take a truly dark turn for the Chinese community. Starting in April 1966, what happened then?
Well, you have to remember that Indonesia was experiencing some serious economic woes at the time.
Yep.
The military, always masters of manipulation, seized on this, using the Chinese community as a scapegoat for the country's financial troubles.
It's that age-old tactic. Find a vulnerable group to blame for complex problems.
Right.
But how did they actually carry this out?
They employed a multi-pronged approach. They forced Chinese Indonesians to pledge loyalty to the regime, a public display of submission. That put them in a terrifying position.
Wow.
Then they organized these massive anti-China rallies, whipping up public resentment and creating a dangerous mob mentality.
And this wasn't just rhetoric. It translated into real-world violence.
Absolutely. Chinese-owned businesses were attacked, looted and destroyed. Homes were ransacked. It was a wave of terror designed to punish and dispossess the Chinese community.
It's almost unimaginable to be targeted and terrorized simply because of your ethnicity.
It's a chilling reminder of how quickly prejudice can turn into violence, especially when it's fueled by those in power. And what's particularly disturbing is the level of control the military maintained. Throughout this chaos, they weren't just instigating the violence, they were also regulating it.
What do you mean by regulating the violence?
Melvin's research suggests that the military would intervene if the violence became too destabilizing, if it threatened to disrupt the broader power structure. They used civilian militias, often recruited from youth groups, as their foot soldiers, arming them and directing them towards specific targets.
It's like they were using these militias as tools, dialing the violence up or down as needed. Can you imagine being a young person caught up in this frenzy?
It's a horrifying thought. And Melvin actually uncovered a document from the North Aceh region that outlines the distribution of weapons to these civilian groups. It's a chillingly bureaucratic record of how the military orchestrated the violence.
So it wasn't just a mob running wild. This was a carefully planned and executed operation.
Yeah.
With the military pulling the strings. From behind the scenes, did Melvin's research reveal any specifics about how these killings were carried out?
Melvin's work details the chilling systematization of the brutality. There were public executions, often carried out by civilians, under military supervision. A terrifying spectacle designed to instill terror in the population. And then you had these systematic killings at secret military-controlled locations, where people were simply disappeared.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the cruelty.
And it wasn't just the physical violence that was so devastating. The military also engaged in a systematic purge of the civil service, targeting anyone suspected of having even the slightest connection to the PKI.
So even if you survive the initial wave of violence, you can still lose your job, your livelihood, your entire life, based on mere suspicion.
Exactly. It was a comprehensive campaign of terror designed to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the military's grip on power. And the Chinese community, already vulnerable, bore the brunt of this brutality.
Melvin's work does a really powerful job of highlighting the personal stories of those who were targeted. These weren't just statistics. These were real people with families, dreams and lives that were brutally cut short.
One story that particularly resonated with me was that of a man named Hamza. He wasn't even a member of the PKI, but he was outspoken about advocating for better economic conditions for peasants. That was enough to get him labeled a communist sympathizer and targeted by the military.
So even advocating for social justice could put you in danger.
Absolutely. The military created an environment where Any form of dissent, even if it had nothing to do with communism, was seen as a threat.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly freedom can be eroded when fear and paranoia take hold. And it makes you wonder, how did the Indonesian government and society at large respond to these atrocities? Was there any pushback, any attempt to hold the perpetrators accountable?
Sadly, the response was largely one of silence and denial. The military, having seized control of the narrative, was able to cover up the true extent of the killings and intimidate survivors into staying quiet.
So there was no reckoning, no justice for the victim.
Not at the time. It took decades for the truth to start to emerge, thanks in large part to the work of scholars like Jess Melvin, who tirelessly pieced together the fragments of history and amplified the voices of the survivors.
Her work is so crucial, not just for documenting the historical record, but for giving voice to those who were silenced for so long.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the pursuit of justice is a long and often difficult journey, but it's a journey worth taking. We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to ourselves to ensure that these atrocities are never forgotten and that those responsible are held accountable.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the political context to the military's calculated tactics to the devastating impact on the Chinese community. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and consider the broader implications of Melvin's work. When we come back, we'll delve into the legacy of these killings and what lessons we can draw. From this dark chapter of history, we've been exploring the Indonesian mass killings of 1965-66, focusing on the Chinese community in Aceh based on the research of Jess Melvin. What's striking is how this event wasn't just a singular tragedy, but seems to connect to larger patterns, both within Indonesia and globally.
That's one of the most powerful aspects of Melvin's work. She places these killings within a broader historical and political context. It's not just about understanding what happened in Aceh, but about recognizing the systematic nature of the violence, the deliberate targeting of specific groups, and the chilling parallels with other instances of genocide and ethnic cleansing throughout history.
So what are some of those parallels? What can we learn by comparing this event to others?
Well, one obvious connection is to the Holocaust. While the scale and methods were different, the underlying dynamics of scapegoating, dehumanization, and the use of propaganda to incite hatred are eerily similar. Both events show how easily prejudice can be weaponized by those in power, leading to unimaginable acts of violence.
It's a terrifying reminder that these kinds of atrocities aren't relegated to the past. The ingredients for genocide still exist today.
Exactly. Another parallel we see is with the Rwandan genocide, where the Hutu majority was incited against the Tutsi minority. In both cases, existing ethnic tensions were exploited, and the media was used to spread hateful propaganda, creating a climate where violence became almost inevitable.
Like a blueprint for how to orchestrate mass violence, identify a vulnerable group, demonize them, and then unleash the mob.
And sadly, that blueprint has been used repeatedly throughout history. We see it in the Armenian genocide, the Cambodian genocide, the Bosnian War, and countless other conflicts. The specific details may vary, but the underlying dynamics of power, prejudice, and manipulation are chillingly consistent.
It's a sobering thought, but I think it's important to confront these parallels, to learn from history, and to be vigilant against any signs of similar patterns emerging in our own time.
Absolutely. And that's why Melvin's work is so crucial. By meticulously documenting the Indonesian killings, she's providing us with a powerful case study of how genocide unfolds, how perpetrators manipulate information and exploit existing prejudices, and how easily societies can succumb to the lure of violence.
But it's not just about looking at the past. Melvin's work also has profound implications for the present and future.
Right. One of the key takeaways is the importance of truth-telling and accountability. For decades, the Indonesian government denied the true extent of the killings, silenced survivors, and protected the perpetrators.
It's that age-old tactic of trying to bury the past and sweep the truth under the rug.
But as Melvin's work shows, the truth has a way of eventually surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And until there is a full accounting of the past, there can be no genuine reconciliation or healing.
So what steps need to be taken to achieve that kind of accountability?
Well, it starts with acknowledging the truth of what happened, educating future generations about this dark chapter, and creating spaces where survivors can share their stories and seek justice. It also requires holding those responsible for the killings accountable, no matter how long ago the crimes were committed.
It's a tall order, especially in a country where the military still holds considerable power, and many of the perpetrators remain in positions of authority.
It's definitely a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. We've seen progress in other countries that have grappled with similar legacies of violence. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, provided a model for how to confront the past and begin the process of healing.
It's about finding a way to balance the need for justice with the desire for reconciliation.
Exactly. And it's not just about legal accountability. It's also about social and cultural accountability, challenging the narratives that justified the violence, confronting the prejudices that made it possible, and building a more inclusive and equitable society.
So it's a multifaceted process that requires a commitment from all levels of society.
Absolutely. And it's a process that's still ongoing in Indonesia. There are courageous individuals and organizations working tirelessly to uncover the truth, support survivors, and advocate for justice.
Melvin's work has helped to amplify their voices and bring this issue to international attention.
Right. And her research provides a roadmap for future investigations, a framework for understanding how these events unfolded, and a call to action for all of us to stand up against injustice and work towards a more just and peaceful world.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening and, frankly, quite disturbing. But it's so important that we engage with these difficult histories, learn from them, and commit ourselves to preventing such horrors from happening again.
If there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this episode, it's that these events weren't inevitable. They were the result of choices made by individuals and institutions, choices driven by power, fear, and prejudice. And we have a responsibility to learn from those choices, to challenge similar dynamics when we see them emerging, and to work towards a world where such atrocities are never repeated.
So where can our listeners go to learn more about this period of Indonesian history and the ongoing efforts for truth and justice?
Well, I highly recommend exploring Jess Melvin's work. Her research is incredibly detailed and insightful, and she provides extensive resources for further reading. There are also a number of organizations working on these issues, like the International Center for Transitional Justice and the Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights, that have valuable information and resources available.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed or distressed by what you've learned today, please know that you're not alone. There are resources available to help you process these difficult emotions and connect with others who are working for justice and healing.
Remember, even small actions can make a difference. Sharing this information with others, supporting organizations working on these issues, and speaking out against injustice, all of these things contribute to creating a more just and compassionate world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy topic, but a crucial one to explore. We hope you'll continue to learn, to question, and to engage with these challenging issues. Until next time, keep seeking truth and keep fighting for justice.